I'm Nick Knudsen, joined by Will Miles and our guest, the five-star nerd, Bill Sikes. Welcome to Stand Up and Holler. On tonight's episode, we'll discuss why Mullen and McElwain failed at Florida, what Napier has changed so far. We'll take a look at Bill Sikes' latest article up today on readandreaction.com, which provides us with the root cause behind a decade's worth of frustration with the offensive line and why there's hope that might be coming pretty soon with this Billy Napier staff. So we'll hope to get that situation resolved quickly with Billy Napier. And now that National Signing Day is in the books, Will Miles says it's time to deliver on a top 3 recruiting class for 2023. But will the Gators get it done? First and foremost, Bill Sikes, welcome to the show tonight. Appreciate you taking the time to come on, man.
Absolutely, guys. It's great to be here. It's my first time on with you, the two of you, and Nick, first time working with you, and I really appreciate the opportunity.
All right, let's jump in here with 2 bits. We're gonna dig in on why Dan Mullen and Jim McElwain ended up failing at the University of Florida. Let's break it up here, guys. We'll start with McElwain. Sikes, let's start with you, man. Let's get your thoughts on that.
In my mind, it was pretty simple. There was a talent gap there. Things were moving in the wrong direction. The offense was sputtering. McElwain comes in, doesn't fix the talent gap. And quite frankly, in year 3, even though it kind of caught some people off guard, some people still think they didn't give him enough leash. But at that point, the quality of the process didn't justify the amount of progress. And I think it would be one thing if he had come out and landed great recruiting classes and it was demonstrably getting better. But we knew that things weren't right when he took 2 losses back-to-back to Alabama and Atlanta. And then here he comes with a 2017 class that's got 1 top 100 player. And I just don't think at the end of the day that the people that call the shots in Gainesville play the message board games. I think they sit there and look and say, okay, we got a historically bad 2015 class. We've got a 2016 class that found a few under the radar people, but now it's reverting in 2017. At what point does this guy take the next step and fix this? And then when he comes out on top of that and you get 7 players arrested and you have a 4-7 season, you're not going to get the benefit of the doubt. There's no reason to. It wasn't moving in the right direction. Like I said, the progress wasn't enough to justify the process.
Yeah, man, I think it's actually funny, Bill. You've written a lot about bump classes for Read and Reaction. You've talked about it a lot on message boards, I'm sure. But, when you go down the bump class here for McElwain in 2016, it's really interesting because the best players from that bump class were Kyle Trask, who was the absolute lowest ranked player in the class, and then Ja'Kai Polite, who was ranked 741st. You obviously have Voshon Joseph, Brett Heggie, LaMichael Pirine, Josh Hammond, Freddie Swain, Felipe Franks, and Chauncey Gardner. But, you look at that and you go, Gardner Johnson was the only guy who maybe didn't make all SEC, who maybe might have deserved it. And then Pirine was a very solid player, but not a star. Trask obviously was very good. Polite had the one good year, but you start thinking about what you need to get out of that second class. And one of the reasons we wanted to go back and look at McElwain and Mullen's regime was to sort of project into what we're looking for out of Billy Napier. The bump class for Alabama, I think, produced like 8 all SEC guys, maybe 9 all SEC guys. And you've written before about all SEC talent and what you need in terms of minimums and things like that. And to me, that's the beginning of the end. I mean, you talk about a talent gap and filling that talent gap, but beyond that, just, if you're not going to have that, if you're going to have that talent gap, you're going to have to over deliver. And there've been a lot of sort of, I guess, revisionist history in terms of the eye for talent that Jim McElwain had. But when you start going down the number of all SEC guys that came out of these recruiting classes, it's on par with the Auburns of the world and the Kentuckys of the world and those sorts of things. It's not necessarily, it's definitely not on par with Alabama, certainly not with Georgia recently. And so, it's funny, you look back and go, and I was sort of a late convert to this, but you look at that 2016 class and you would have immediately said, yeah, this probably isn't going to work out. And same thing as we move into talking about Mullen, you look at that 2019 class, it's sort of the same story.
Yeah, Kyle Trask, Kadarius Toney, and now Billy Napier. Those 3 names might do a lot to rewrite some of the history with Jim McElwain at the University of Florida. Unfortunately, for those of us who lived through it and remember it clearly, did y'all feel a connection with the guy at any point as that's my coach? I'm going to go to battle for this guy. Like, I just feel like he never really connected from day one with the fan base. This was a guy who came in here, little bit on the Bama reputation, didn't have much time at Colorado State, hadn't been a head coach for that long, and he was sold as the savior of the offense. Aside from one special night in the swamp with Will Grier, really you never got it going on that side of the ball at all. And so the thing he was supposed to be good at, he didn't come in and deliver. And I look at that, I never felt like it really, like we had that a little bit of a downfall with Muschamp. There was no point that there was a real upswing under McElwain with any hope. Unlike Dan Mullen, who came in, started strong, and then fell off a cliff. I shouldn't even say faded, just fell off a cliff. At first, you looked at what Dan Mullen was doing, the offense, a little bit of an offensive revival, bringing in pumping some life into Felipe Franks in that offense early on, developing Kyle Trask and how that ended up playing out. Things were looking good for a while. You two are known for hammering on the recruiting side of things. Unfortunately, that side never got off the ground, ended up catching up with Mullen, and really both sides on the field. The on the field was supposed to save Mullen. That ended up not coming through in 2021. And really, I honestly think if you would have taken Dan Mullen and hired him right after Urban Meyer in that early part of the 2010s, where Muschamp coached, you might have seen multiple SEC East titles. Instead, he comes in the later part of the decade where Kirby's got a machine up and running, and it just became clear that Mullen could not compete with Kirby on a year in and year out basis in terms of fielding the type of talent required to compete for the SEC title and the national title, which are the expectations at the University of Florida.
I think it's because he's a glorified offensive coordinator. And I know that sounds like a cheap, podcast dig, but the guy is not interested in recruiting. He made that clear by his actions. He's not clear in holding his staff accountable. He's not clear on not committed to making tough depth chart decisions. All the other things that make head coaches great, the details and the lesser heralded aspects of program building and program management, Mullen just didn't seem interested in doing any of it. He was a great offensive mind. I think he still is. I think that was evident in what he did with Franks, and I think he's one of the better guys in the country at I can take this kind of quarterback and do well with him, depending on their skill set. But it just takes more than that. I mean, his initial staff was a disaster. There was no attention to special teams. I mean, you name it, you go right down the list. And that's what I was asking people, late last year. I'm like, what area of this program, besides his neat play calling, is championship level excellence? And there just really wasn't anything, and it really cost him. However, this talent level issue, it's the thing, the monster that's hovering over this program. They can't get out from under it. And if you're not going to handle that through not just stars-based recruiting, but quality recruiting in your evaluations and in your player retention and finding good fits, if you're not going to fix that and close that gap, you better be perfect everywhere else. And once the shine started to come off of the apple with those other areas, he was doomed.
Thanks. With all that being said, we were a composite top 10 team, right? In terms of talent in the country, were we like top 7 last year, I believe. And all those criticisms are fair with Mullen, but would you say that he's left it in a much better spot than he inherited from Jim McElwain?
No, and I know this not towards you, but I reject I think the efficacy of the composite, the way people are using it, or I think it's being emphasized because it applies those star ratings on an apples to apples basis with these transfers. But the problem is these transfers are transfers, and they didn't make it in a lot of cases at their other school. And I just don't know that we can use this equation to accurately predict. And furthermore, the level of former top 10 recruits at their positions is still dropping on offense. When you look at what they've got on defense and the seniors this year, the fourth-year seniors from the 2019 class, that class has been gutted. And part of that was through bad recruiting. And again, not just the stars basis, but hey, I'm going to go take this Chris Steele kid who's will be his third school choice, and he's from California. That's a high percentage pick. Well, he's gone. Now Hopper's gone. Vogel's gone. Diabate's gone. And so I think like the top 4 guys of that class are gone. And I think this roster is in a little bit of rough shape, and it's going to be, if Napier's able to get a lot out of it, it's not only a credit to him, but it is a credit to those transfers producing that he's bringing in, because when you look at just the high school recruits that they brought in, it's dismal.
I think at the same time, we forget where Florida was in 2017 and where that team was. And so to say that it's that much worse than it was under Jim McElwain, I don't know that you can necessarily say that, though certainly I think the transfer portal gives you a faster opportunity to maybe fix things, where you can push out some people that you think don't necessarily meet what you're trying to do from a program perspective, as opposed to when Mullen came in, that was sort of in its infancy. Obviously he took advantage of it. And that was one of the things where I think some of the people, when we would make stars based arguments, would push back. And the comment was always, yeah, if you hit on these transfers, then great, right? You hit on the transfer, it can sort of be, the Band-Aid on the bullet hole. But if you miss on the transfers, then the patient bleeds out. And that's really what happened in both 2020 and 2021, right? Is you bring in those defensive tackles and say, hey, we brought in 3 defensive tackles. Well, but if they're not difference makers, then it doesn't really make that big of a difference. And you think about it, even with Adam Schuler when he came in, I think he was much more of a contributor than any of us thought he was going to be when he came in. And just imagine what would have happened to that defense if they hadn't had Schuler in the middle there the first couple of years. But we can talk all we want about recruiting, but the big thing, Jeffrey Todd Grantham is the elephant in the room for all of this stuff. And that sort of, I think, goes to what you were saying, Bill, about the overall program management, right? I mean, it was obvious to everyone after that third year, and really it was obvious to everyone before he even came in, that it wasn't a major, hey, this guy has the opportunity to be fantastic. I think that's one of the things, I don't know whether Patrick Toney's going to be an awesome defensive coordinator, but there's no track record saying he's going to be average or below average. And, that was the thing about Grantham when he came in. You're like, he's okay, but he's not going to be great. And so, that's not the standard. You can come in talking about relentless effort. You can come in talking about the Gator standard, but you just brought in a defensive coordinator that everybody in Athens laughed at when you brought him in, because they've gone through the Grantham experience and knew that was not going to be something that they necessarily feared. And so, those hard decisions, telling your friends you don't want them around because you need to be cutthroat, was something that I think it's interesting. There've been a couple of, articles about Napier and some of the recruits where he had sent other coaches to say, hey, we're not going to recruit you anymore, and those sorts of things. At the time, it doesn't necessarily reflect real well on the program, but he's got a limited amount of time. And at some point you're going to have to cut bait. You're going to have to hurt some people's feelings. And, the fact that those stories are coming out, I think in some ways may give Florida fans a little bit of comfort that if there's a coordinator, if there's a staff member, if there's somebody who's not carrying their water or carrying their weight, then they're not going to be here anymore. And he's going to bring in somebody who can.
Well, I think that's exactly what Sikes mentioned too. When you mentioned Napier sending people out to do it, Napier seems to have, everyone's has a role. Everyone's role matters. And if he needs somebody to go do something, he seems like, even the way he handled the class coming in, being able to tell a couple of those 4-star guys, clearly it's not a fit. Make sure to evaluate your options, whatever he said to them, where we had that mass hit at the beginning of the recruiting class. I definitely think that shows that he's not afraid to make a difficult decision. I don't think we're going to see a guy throw a shoe and then not get pulled out of the game. Damian Pierce been loving getting all the updates about how great he's doing at the Senior Bowl, but that guy's not going to get 7 carries a game next year. I think we're going to see an evolution in how this coaching staff handles things, and that's a good transition here into 4 bits, talking about some of the changes we've seen in the Billy Napier era so far. And I'll start with a couple of simple notes, guys. The program seems as organized as it's been on all fronts in a long time. He inspires confidence with this level of precision that he seems to be attacking things with. Now, granted, everything's on paper and everything's a plan. And I think Mike Tyson said that everyone has a plan until you get punched in the face, right? So nothing's started yet. Will Miles just turned on. Will Miles declared the honeymoon's over on National Signing Day, and the pressure's on for a top-3 class before August. So we're working on it. The plan sounds great on paper, but we'll see results too. But let's not kid ourselves. This is some much needed fresh energy here. And Mullen was some fresh energy too in 2018, but a little bit different. I think we were so desperate that anything was good at that time. different level. I feel like the expectations raised a little bit. It just, even look at the simple things with around the program, with the food, the parking, the living situation for the players. And I think these are all good signs for what's to come. And you have to have a little bit of confidence as a fan base seeing these things go on around the program now.
I think so. I mean, I would compare it to this. Back when Greg Nord was brought in, he came in from Western Kentucky, had really never done anything, and fans were understandably not excited. And he didn't deliver a whole lot either. But Napier's going out and getting people from all over the country that have had personal success stories. They've been around big time programs. Katie Turner is coming from Georgia, where they're putting together #1 recruiting classes. So it passes the sniff test when you say, is Napier likely putting together a group of people that understand what it takes to have success? I think he does, and he is. And I don't see how it couldn't be better. Just with the magnitude of disorganization and disinterest, it's just hard to imagine things not being significantly better.
You mean calling ETN might be a good thing to do?
Yeah, it might be beneficial to give the guy a ring. Yeah.
How organized.
Right. I mean, and I think I may have told the story on Gators Breakdown last time I was on, but like during the last regime, at one point, Jordan Battle, he's going to be an NFL safety. His dad was talking to me on Twitter. I said, "Hey, you guys going to come to Florida?" He said, "We love Florida, but they are so disorganized, we don't even know who his lead recruiter is." So then I had to turn around and email Lee Begley and said, "Hey, I just thought you might want to know that this guy who should be at the top of your list has no idea what's going on." I cannot fathom that happening with this 50-person army that Napier's building. So yes, I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt here, but just going down the list and seeing who these faces are, where they're coming from, I think, and I hope everything's about to change.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because I pretty much picked against Mullen every game for that first year. And one of the reasons I did is that I didn't really buy into what he was selling early on, and certainly didn't once the recruiting numbers started to come back. And, they were sitting there in like the mid 30s in 2018 for his bump class. And you're like, God, this really needs to pick up quick. But he even sort of talked about like, needing the fans in the stands in order to like bring the wins rather than an understanding of market forces where you go out there and you win. And that's what brings people into the stands. Just that sort of detail where it's like, look, going out and so there were two problems with that. One is that Florida fans had been supporting the program from a monetary perspective the entire way through, but also, the quality of football in the Muschamp and McElwain eras had been so bad on the offensive side of the ball that you can forgive Florida fans for sort of saying, hey, show us a couple of 30-point games before we get all that excited about what's going on with the program. And so it's interesting. I mean, we've talked about this multiple times about Dan Mullen saying that, or about Urban Meyer in his book with Buddy Martin saying that he needed to keep Mullen away from Tebow because they were afraid that if he recruited Tebow, Tebow was going to go someplace else. And that's sort of been the story of the Mullen era. You think about, again, why was he not able to get things accomplished? That right there is the story, right? Is, you got to build up like a critical mass of people who are behind you. And what I would say is that, the press conference where Napier announces, he starts talking about people in the front office who are helping him out with different things. He starts lauding the pilots who are flying him around. Now, all that stuff is great when you haven't had anything, when you haven't had to do anything yet. Obviously, if you go out on the field and you lose, or if you all of a sudden get beat on the recruiting trail by everybody in the same way Mullen did, we're all going to look at it and say, who cares that you're giving shout outs to the pilots. But I think it's a trickle down thing where that level of attention to detail, to know that you need to go out and you need to thank all those people, to know that you've got this army behind you, that attention to detail. And, the stuff like they brought out the new facilities with the standard where, it almost looks like a pool in a Vegas casino where those guys are going to be staying, like that level of detail. I don't think that's what gets recruits, but I think it's not what gets recruits. Well, but I think the point is the point I would make is that it's not that necessarily brings in a recruit. The recruit is coming because of the head coach, and he thinks the head coach is going to get him to the NFL. And right. If you made me stay in a crappy dorm, but I was a recruit, and I knew you were going to get me to the NFL, like, hey, I'm still going to keep you in the list of teams that are running. The issue is when you have all those really nice facilities and you have that attention to detail and you take care of the parking and you take care of the food and all that sort of stuff. What that really says is you've got an attention to detail that the players are important, that you're going to put the energy and the organization into it to make sure that they're successful. So if I look at the things that Napier's changed on the good side, when I look and say, why do I have hope? It's because all the little trickle down things that you would expect to see from a level of attention to detail are there. Now, obviously, it still has to convert over into results, and we haven't seen that yet. I mean, if he'd have brought in Harold Perkins and Jacoby Matthews last week, I'd be saying, okay, now we're seeing some results. But, obviously breaking the IMG curse is a little bit of that. Getting Devin Moore from Naples is also a little bit of that. But there is an enormous segment of guys, highly rated guys in the state of Florida for next year. And so we're going to get to see, and I'm glad to see that organization seems to be there, because like you said, Bill, it did not seem to be there with the previous administration.
Hey, one more thing on that. I think the way to look at this, culture as a reflection of values. And when you mentioned that Napier got up on the podium and the day he was hired and started thanking the person that, got him a cup of water, the person that, pulls the truck around, the pilots, and just, he went right down the list. And that tells me this is a coach who understands that everybody's got a job, that everybody has not only value, but that they're needed in the program, that you actually need to practice special teams, that you need that extra recruit, that you need to hold the guy accountable when he throws the shoe on the field, because that's not what we've had. So I do find that is a tangible sign that this guy understands what it takes.
Yeah, I'm hoping this time next year he's going to be pounding the desk like Jimbo, talking about what a quality university that these 7 5-star recruits have signed up for, and that they can't wait for their alumni connections when they graduate. That's what I'm hoping to see next year around this time. Look, you look at the top 3 of the. I guess we can get into this a little more in a dollar, but just real quick, we'll touch on it. You look at the top 3. You got Jimbo, Saban, and Kirby sitting up there, and for the better part of the last decade, Saban, or half decade anyway, with Kirby in the mix there. Sykes, what is so damn special that's happening at these schools that is in the Saban formula for recruiting clearly? And Napier is in that mix. We've had 2 Saban guys, Muschamp and McElwain. We did not get those type of results. We did a little bit with Muschamp on the recruiting trail, but he forgot to do offense most years, so he forgot to recruit offense sometimes too. But other than that, what is in the formula there that you think Napier is going to hit on that other coaches haven't quite grasped at this school?
Well, for me, I want to keep coming back to these 2 words that I want to keep looking for this, and that's progress through process. And the thing is, I don't know that Florida can get up to what we've seen from Texas A&M. They might. Maybe if NIL kicks into high gear, maybe if they start putting some serious wins on tape, they may just get to the number 1 spot in the country. But I just want to see sound process. I don't want recruits to be talking about how they don't hear from the coaches every year. Sometimes it was like every week when I was covering this stuff closely. I don't want to hear that they let a guy commit that they weren't really sure about, but he already made it public, so I guess we'll just take him. I want to hear that there's a tight ship, that they're covering all their bases, that are working their butts off, that they've got adequate staffing, that they're doing everything they can to get these recruits. And I believe that if they do that, they can get up in at least to that top 5 range, which is a historic minimum threshold, not the optimal threshold, not the optimal standard for winning championships. But I just want to see the process lead to progress, and then we'll kind of evaluate it from there. But as far as what they're doing, I think they've got massive organizations. I think they're well-funded. I think they're well-organized. I think that they have all those benefits of all these things that people have used as excuses for bad recruiting. And it's what takes them from very good to elite. But Florida hasn't even been very good. Show me very good, and let's see from there.
What are your thoughts on that, Will?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm probably a little bit more I'm going to put a lot more emphasis, not necessarily on the national rank, but I've said top 3, but the reality is that's where you got to be, right? Otherwise you're falling behind these other teams. Now, I mean, if they're fourth or they're fifth nationally and they got, 2 or 3 5-star guys.
Oh, don't go soft on us now.
I'm not going that soft. I mean, if they're fourth or fifth, I'm not going to say that Napier needs to get fired. But I mean, if they're ninth, I'm going to sit there and go, it's just as worrisome as 2016 and just as worrisome as 2019. And, Bill, I went down the 2016 roster, but you go down to 2019, it's even worse. It's just a disaster area of guys who either didn't contribute or didn't see the field until it was just absolutely necessary to put them out there because of either injuries or because finally Grantham left and they finally threw some people out there. And the weird thing is you look at it and there's so much experience from that 2020 class on the defensive side of the ball that's coming back this year. And you're like, wait a minute, like 2019 is when you're supposed to load up your team with talent. And that just did not happen. None of those guys really converted into the guys who you expect to see. And so, look, I mean, maybe we look back and it's a 7th ranked class overall, but you got 7 or 8 all SEC guys coming out of it because Napier's a straight evaluator. But I've been hearing for a decade now that Florida has these coaches who have this secret sauce who can get around the
master evaluators.
They can get around the national rankings, right? Give the guy a dog, he can play quarterback, and all of a sudden it'll be fine. Well, it turns out that Will Grier needs to be your quarterback, and when he gets popped for steroid or when he gets popped for a supplement, whatever, some sort of performance enhancing supplement there, that all of a sudden the backup quarterback you're not able to convert him into a guy who can win a ton of games. That Florida never had a shot in those SEC championship games against Alabama. And to be honest, really didn't have a shot in the SEC championship game against Alabama in 2020 either. That game was close at the end, but they were down by 2 touchdowns when they scored with just a little bit of time left. And Steve Spurrier's right. He likes sort of digging that knife at the end, but he sort of talks about how hopefully Napier will be able to come along and maybe actually beat Alabama as opposed to just playing them close. And same thing, right? I mean, I don't know why it's acceptable to sit there and get your butt beat by the elite of the SEC recruiting when it's not acceptable to anybody to go out and get your butt beat on the field. It's one of these things that I don't understand the disconnect where it's like, everybody loved when Mullen got out there and talked about how he wants to beat everybody thumb wrestling, but then that didn't actually
but only thumb wrestling.
So, I mean, look, I top 3 classes are necessary. The state of Florida is loaded. We'll get to it in a little bit. It's never going to be better than right now because, Bill, and you've said this multiple times, you can't negative recruit against Napier. And this class is mostly going to get put together by August or September. So by the time the kickoff happens, he's already built the relationships. He's already brought those guys in, and you can't say he's not going to be able to do it. And so it has nothing to do with whether you win games on the field. It has everything to do with your ability to sell, your ability to be organized, your ability to out contact people. And in the world of name, image, and likeness, your ability to outpay them. And, look, if Texas A&M was able to do that, good for them. They did it within the rules, theoretically. And as long as they did it within the rules, we talked about this last week, Nick. Why is Jimbo so defensive? If you paid them and they came there, that's the rules.
That's an ego thing.
Oh, I know. That was the point. But again, if that's all it takes, I mean, Florida has some deep pockets, and there's a reason why Florida State has just absolutely god awful recruiting. Part of it is because of Norvell not being a great recruiter, but what are they going to do in the NIL? They're always running they're always running almost in the red. Florida's always making a ton of money, and there's a ton of alumni out there who can help support that sort of stuff. So, you got oil money out in Texas, but there's plenty of money at Florida to be able to do that too. So, Napier came in and supposedly negotiated everything that he needed in order to turn Florida around.
He did not offer me a contract, though, Will. That might be the problem.
Well, me either, Bill. But
one more thing, though. You were mentioning the top 3. The reason I'm focused on top 5. Now, not only have I harped on this for 20 years about how that's the historic minimum, unless you have a 5-star quarterback, is at least one top 5 class, but also twice in the last 5 years, the number 3 class has required 5 5-stars because it's that high. I just don't, if that was to happen and Napier is sitting 4th or 5th, but he's got 3, I would call that a job well done. Maybe it's not enough to get where they need to be, but again, process and progress. If that's real progress, that's not the kind of fake progress everybody was trumpeting in that 2019 class when they were number 9 or 10, whatever it was. that's where I'm at.
I get what you're saying. I also think it's interesting because if you look at the actual 2022 class, there are tiers, right? So you look at it in A&M, Alabama, and Georgia, and there's a drop off to Ohio State, but it's not that significant. But there's a significant drop off to Texas, Penn State, Notre Dame, Oklahoma, and Michigan at 5 through 9. So if you're in tier 1, I'm not going to yell at you if you're not in the top 3, right? But you got to be in tier 1. You can't sit there and be like, oh, well, we're gonna recruit the same as Penn State. It's like Penn State hasn't been really elite in years, and James Franklin, despite his $100 million contract or whatever, they go 10-2, can't beat Ohio State, can't beat Michigan sometimes, and usually drop a game they shouldn't along the way. Turns out that's exactly what we got in 2018, 2019 before the defense fell apart, right? So if I'm looking for what needs to happen, okay, maybe you can talk me off a top 3, but you got to be in tier 1. You can't sit there and go, well, we're going to be a second tier recruiting team in the SEC, because we've been harping on this I've been harping on it for years, ever since you started teaching it to me, Bill, which is that
you're not wrong though.
The conference ranking is what matters. So if you're 5th in the conference, you only win like 55 or 60% of your conference games historically, as opposed to if you're 1st in the conference, you win like 80 or 85% of your conference games. Turns out that's kind of critical when only 1 or 2 teams from your conference makes the playoff.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong. I'm not saying you are absolutely on the money. They really need a number 1 class. I think somebody put on Twitter the other day that, like, what was it, 18 or 19 out of the last 22 years, the number 1 class eventually has gone on to win a title in 3 to 4 years. You technically are much better off with that. I'm just saying that I'm kind of playing the softy here and saying, well, maybe it's not enough to get that top 5 class, but A, that's real progress. And B, at least you can say there's a historical precedent. But what you're saying is the way they need to be right there amongst the elite, the very tip top.
Well, let's put a pin in that. We'll cover all that in $1. But one way Florida can work their way into that top 3 that we're talking about is through better recruiting along the offensive line here for 6 bits. We'll talk about Bill Sikes' article here on readandreaction.com. Be sure to check it out if you haven't got a look at it yet. But I was able to get an early look at the article, Sikes, and it really brings clarity to the causes behind a bleak decade of offensive line play at Florida. I found one of the lines I'll start with here that I found really interesting. You said the decline has been so steep that since 2010, Florida and Vanderbilt are the only 2 SEC programs without an AP first-team All-SEC offensive lineman. I think that would shock most folks in Gainesville, even though most folks following are aware of the issues, but just you don't want to be lumped in with Vanderbilt on a lot of football facts and figures.
No, you do not. Yeah, it's been bad. And it hasn't always been awful, though. And I tried to convey that because some people have kind of pushed back on these offensive line criticisms that I've mentioned and said, well, they played well against Alabama, or they weren't terrible, and, they look good around Trask, but it's consistently degraded. Even when they have found a starting 5 depth, it's been horrible. And part of that too, I would say that Trask really bailed out that offensive line. I mean, his pocket adjustments and movement and evasion of the pass rush made them look better than they were. And I think Mullen also deserves some credit there, along with Emory Jones. The scheme there was not one that you're going to want to tee off very often until they inexplicably throw him 36 times in the bowl game against UCF, but the offensive line has been a clear problem for this program throughout the decade. And this article really explains why. I laid out the issues and kind of how they stacked on top of one another in a chronological order and got us to where we are today. And that's needing improvement.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not just stars, though, right? I mean, that was the thing. Is, you and I harp on that a lot, and obviously that matters. But even Will Muschamp's class, which was number 3 back in, what was it, 2013, something like that. But you really sort of focused in on not just the stars argument, but also obviously that matters, but then also just the numbers and how those compare to Alabama and Georgia and LSU. So maybe you can talk about that a little bit.
Well, as far as, the main thing was I actually avoided the recruiting aspect of this. It is a major factor, and I do address it, but it's probably the shortest part of the in-depth article because I knew that's kind of what people were expecting. And I wanted people to understand that, look, this is not just a matter of they got this guy that Tennessee wanted, but meanwhile, Alabama and Georgia got better ones. It was a matter, it started with tiny class sizes. They just didn't get enough guys in the locker room to field an offensive line for about 3 years. Then it starts swinging wildly up and down. So it's this inefficient roster management. But then those guys start leaving, and they left in droves. And that's when you get to the McElwain era, just kind of all hell breaks loose. And then you end up with like 5 transfer starters at right tackle in the last 9 years. It's just been crazy, and not great ones either. It's not like they took some number 1 JUCO that couldn't qualify, out of high school. But then again, over all that, the whole time, the quality of the offensive line recruits they were taking was degrading throughout the last 10 to 12 years. And that brought us to where we're at now. And that's where they've got 2 mediocre transfers starting on the offensive line. With John Hevesy in control, which in itself is just mind-boggling. Well, not now, but a few months ago.
That's what I found the most interesting about the article was a lot of people, the frustration's been centered around Hevesy for a few years now. And you really take the problem back into the inefficiencies in the roster management, like you mentioned, where we're only bringing in a couple of guys for a couple seasons in a row. But also the part of your article I found really interesting was the O-line retention. You went through Alabama, Auburn, Georgia, Florida, and LSU, but those other 4 are the other 4 have won the SEC in the last decade. Florida has almost double the attrition rate with guys leaving early from the program, not related to the NFL, than any of those other schools built. How do you build a successful offensive line if you're not only recruiting at the numbers you need, but you got 43% of these dudes are leaving the program early at some point, whether it's through transfer, medical, or whatever. You went through and literally listed every single one, by the way. So if you want to look into that, you guys can have a look. But great.
Yeah, I tried to really be thorough. I went through every offensive line recruit at every one of those other compared schools, and I researched the rosters, what happened to this guy, did he leave? But yeah, like you said, 43% of Florida's offensive linemen left the program early. And mind you, that does not count the 3 early NFL guys. It goes on up even further from there if you count them. But I didn't want to put them in a negative light. If you're churning out NFL offensive linemen, well, then that's a good thing. That's not a bad thing. But Florida really, by and large, wasn't doing that. These guys were leaving. They led all those other schools in grad transfers, really the listed non-quals. They had more than the others. Total transfers. It's just a mess. It had like 5 or 6 different medical departures, but then I even went into that, how some of these guys came in banged up. And it's like, how do you justify taking unhealthy people when you were desperate for help?
Yeah, well, I think that's how they justified it, right? They were desperate for help, and so had to bring in some of those guys. And I mean, it really is fascinating to go look at just you look at it. It's not like they signed less guys overall over a decade span.
Not really.
But it's so variable in terms of how they do. I mean, basically from 2010 to 2012, they only brought in 6 guys, and 3 of those guys left the program. So you're sitting there with only 3 scholarship guys that you signed over a 3-year period. No wonder that we had the spring game when McElwain came in where there weren't any offensive linemen. I started feeling a little bit bad for Doug Nussmeier. So I kind of hate you for that, Bill, because I don't want to feel bad for Doug Nussmeier, because I just cannot bring myself to feel bad for Doug Nussmeier, but I started to feel a little bit bad for him. And so, had to stop reading at that point and sort of refocus.
But don't feel too bad, because remember, they only brought in 5 offensive linemen over their second and third classes as well. So they contributed to this problem. And that's kind of what I wanted to show, is how where one coach might have done a little better in this area and this one did a little better than there. Muschamp was horrible in all of them, mind you, but every coach has contributed, even back to Meyer, to this problem.
Well, one of the things you did mention, though, I think this article is going to be one of the most complete looks you'll find at the last decade in Gator football to explain the offensive line struggles here. But I do like that it ends with a little bit of ray of hope here. What do you like about the new staff from what you've seen so far in terms of addressing this specific issue?
Well, I think with the line I used in the article was that if you want to fix the offensive line, having a staffer for every starter is a great place to start. And that's exactly what they did. I mean, Napier, and by the way, I know that this has been a little bit of a negative tilt we've discussed here, but there's a lot of sunshine pumping at the end of this article because I'm extremely high on Napier's potential to turn this thing around. I mean, he's got a track record in both recruiting and roster management that I think are well suited to tackle this problem. But to specifically answer your question, as far as the staffers I know about, he's added 5 so far that are going to focus primarily on the offensive line. He's got 2 of his primary staff, an offensive line coach and an assistant offensive line coach, that are going to get on the field with these players during practice that are real deal coaches. And that's not something you see every day. But then he went out and brought in Cheston Blackshear, who is a former second team all SEC Gator, on the offensive line. And then he went out and got, Vallow, I can't remember his name. He's the guy that played for him at ULL just last year.
Louisiana, yeah.
So this is a young guy that is coming out of the program and understands the expectations, understands how to succeed. He was a second team all conference player at ULL under Napier. He's a guy that can add that perspective. Stapleton, the assistant offensive line coach, was a starter in the Super Bowl. So you're going to have guys that, and Rob Sale was an NFL offensive line coach. You got guys that have succeeded every which way on the offensive line, and he's surrounding that unit with people that I believe can make a huge difference. And that's going to help him recruit. That's going to help him retain. That's going to help him develop and help him succeed. And so I think that's a great way to approach this problem.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting too, because it's not just that Napier has a second offensive line coach or that he's got Sale, but I mean, you actually mentioned, you went into sort of Sale's history as well at Louisiana, right? And it almost looks like it's something where if you were looking at Sale as like a candidate for maybe an offensive coordinator or something, you'd look at it and say, well, what kind of impact does he have on an offense? And it looks like when Sale was at Louisiana, they were elite. And then when he left, the offensive line actually took quite a step back, even though Louisiana won the Sun Belt last year. So it's interesting to see that he seems to be, at least statistically, one of the reasons why you would have a lot of hope for Florida coming into 2022.
Absolutely. Yeah. My buddy Swamp Thing has been screaming about that guy for a couple of years. When everybody wanted Hevesy out, he was pointing to Rob Sale. Hey, this guy's the legit item here. And I mean, the fact that the New York Giants hired him out of Louisiana Lafayette, I think speaks volumes. They were ranked, I believe it was 5th and 6th nationally for 2 years. And as far as the highest average or categorical average of advanced metrics for the offensive line at Football Outsiders. That's kind of hard to say, but basically you take all their scores and how they ranked in each category that they tally up, they had the best average, the 5th and 6th best average nationally over those 2 years. So the guy had his offensive line playing well in ways that could be quantified and producing pro talent at a rate that equates and may now surpass Florida the last few years. Mm-hmm. I mean, they put 2 guys in the draft last year. They're about to put another one in the draft. Well, Florida's only had 2 in the last 4 years. So the fact that they had that, and I think it was 11 all-conference performers on the offensive line at ULL during that time, every which way you slice it, that offensive line had success individually and team-wise as a unit. So this is a proven staff, at least at the Sun Belt level. And so that remains the big elephant in the room. Can the success and the process scale upward to the SEC? And we just don't know that. However, in the absence of a proven SEC head coach with these same type of results waltzing in, this is what you have to do. And so is it proven to a degree where it makes it certain? Absolutely not. But is there an objective, reasonable cause for optimism? I think yes.
Do you expect there to be more of a focus on the offensive line in the initial recruiting class, or do you think that's just going to be something that's going to be built over time the next couple of years?
Yes and yes. Here's the deal, guys. Napier wants to run the ball 55% of the time, unless he's going to update his offensive philosophy. He's going to, right in that range is where he's going to want to be. And he does not have a proven track record of big-time quarterback play, unless you go back to like Taj Boyd at Clemson. Okay, so if he's going to have the kind of team that runs right at you, that sets up deep strikes and play action, that gets that outside zone game going that he wants to do, he's going to have to load up in recruiting at running back and offensive line. We're not just talking about quality, but we're talking about numbers. He's going to have to send talent at you in waves. And so I think that's going to require that they stock the shelves. Now, they went out and brought in 3 high school offensive linemen in this class, plus Livingston, who could maybe end up there, and a couple of transfers, which we'll talk about that were big time. So it looks like he's continuing this initial push to land big numbers. He had a 7 offensive line class in his bump class at ULL, and it was historic. I think I mentioned in the article that prior to that, in the 16 years prior, they had only managed to sign 4 3-star offensive linemen ever. They're a 2-star program. Well, Napier exceeded that in his bump class alone. I think it was 5 in his bump class alone. So the guy has made an instant impact there in recruiting for the offensive line that took him and developed him and produced and won with him. And so do I think we see that? Yes. Is it going to be a point of emphasis for him? I think it has to be.
Well, it's a great look at diagnosing the problem and then addressing the potential solutions that may already exist on campus for the Gators. Be sure to check out Bill Sikes' latest article on readingreaction.com about the offensive line at the University of Florida. Let's move on to a dollar and ask the question straight up. Will Florida have a top 3 class in 2023? We haven't finished higher in a 24/7 class rankings that the number 9 since 2014. That's been the highest finish here. The last top 3 finishes, both under Muschamp, 2012 and 2013 at number 3. And guys, Texas A&M, Alabama, Georgia touched on those. I think it's going to be extremely difficult in year 1 of Billy Napier to break into the top 3 with just those 3 alone. But when you factor in, as much as Brian Kelly's dancing has drawn the appropriate criticism, I think LSU is going to be a force, extra force this year on the trail. USC is going to be revived out there with Lincoln Riley. We've already seen some of those 5-star kids turn to USC. Mario at Miami's nothing to sneeze at. And look, University of Florida, you want to compete among the top. I understand that. I'm not making excuses for it not happening, but like for this year, for year 1, I would totally understand not being in the top 3 right off the bat, because I do think some on-field performance needs to be attached to that as well, not just selling hope.
Dude, you on-field performance, haven't you read any of my stuff? Like, no, it doesn't matter for this class. Here's the deal. 39 of the 24/7 composite top 200 guys are from the state of Florida. Now, certainly there's some IMG guys there as well. There's 9 5-star guys. The number 1 recruit in the class right now, Cormani McLean, is a corner. And lo and behold, they didn't really sign a true corner in this class. It looks like he's a 50-50, or he's the number 3 player. Sorry, he's the number 1 player in the state of Florida. He's a 50-50 proposition, Florida State, Florida. So Napier has to win that battle, right? You're Norvell. He hasn't proven to be a very good recruiter. You're coming in, building this whole system together. If it's really a 50-50 proposition between Florida State and Florida, Florida's got to win those battles. But you sort of go down. He broke the IMG curse. So now you got Kamari Wilson going and talking to all of his friends. Samuel Mpemba, an athlete, number 14 overall. You got Francis Malyoga, number 6 overall player. You keep going down. There's a bunch of guys from Orlando. So Malik Bryant, an edge rusher, number 20. You got a guy like Jalen Brown down in Miami. Maybe he ends up at the Hurricanes, right? But then you got a guy like Troy Bowles right now, who's a 50-50 between Ohio State and Georgia, the number 10th ranked player in the state. He's out of Tampa. You got to build that circle around the state. You got to start bringing these guys in. And I don't know, I don't know what's going to come out of the 2024 class, but you're not going to get much better than having 20% of the guys in the top 200 sitting in your state. And if you sign 10 of those guys and 3 or 4 of them are 5-star guys, if you're able to pull that off, then getting into that range is absolutely doable. But, you're going to need to really focus on the state. Now, the good news is that, one of the reasons why I think they struggled with guys like Harold Perkins and their ilk on signing day is those guys were all from Texas and Louisiana. So you think about strategy, and I think this sort of goes back to the conversation we had earlier about Napier. His process here is you better be bringing in your best recruits and focusing all your resources on the guys closest to home. And so if they're still going out to Louisiana to do anything other than sort of cherry pick elite prospects, as opposed to just making sure they rake in as many guys from the state of Florida as they can, then that's the process I think you want to look at overall. But again, I keep going down this list and just keep laughing to myself. The 50th player in the state of Florida is ranked 263rd. So, if they bring in a 20, like, you should be able to get, 15 or 20 of the top guys in the state of Florida if you're going to own the state. Now, I'd have to go back and look at what Urban Meyer actually did back in that 2006 bump class. But I imagine that was an extraordinarily Florida-centric recruiting class. And you start thinking about what that means, like, the state is loaded. And so, out of all the times that you would say, well, it's unreasonable, or, well, it's only a second year, all that sort of stuff, you can't negatively recruit against him. The guy up in Tallahassee's just like, he's losing recruits to Deion Sanders. You got, Cristobal, who has a offensive coordinator from Michigan. Congratulations. I'm not sure that one's going to work out all that well. I just think it's really rife for somebody to take the mantle in the state. And we always were sort of waiting for Dan Mullen to do that. Instead, he just sort of handed the recruits on a silver platter to Alabama and Ohio State and Clemson. So getting those guys out will be priority number one. But again, I think this is an opportunity. And I think one of the things that Napier, underneath his sort of calm demeanor, I really, really hope that cutthroat, hey, we're going to get this guy. We're going to make sure we do what we need to do with NIL. We're going to get into IMG and build that pipeline, all those sorts of things. Those are the things we're going to see because, quite honestly, if he can pull in two of those guys from IMG, he can have two of the top 19 guys in the country, and they're just down the road. And they know what it's like to live in Florida. They like the weather. There's a huge program there that hopefully is going to get them to the NFL. Like, there's a lot to sell if you're a good salesman. And so this will be an opportunity for Napier to prove that he is that kind of salesman.
Well, and I would also add too that, if he's going to want to win on his running backs and offensive line, which that's, to me, it looks like his bread and butter. Not to say he won't have a good quarterback, but you got 4 of the top 6 running backs in the country in the state of Florida, and 2 of them are in Jacksonville. And I know they're focused in on Cedric Baxter right now, who's, he's ranked 13th in the state, but again, 69th nationally. He's down in Orlando. I'd probably be chasing 2 of those guys. Backs today are a little more open to splitting carries and staying fresh. In my opinion, if they've got room, and maybe they only have room for 1, but if they've got room for a second back, how do you let 2 highly rated running backs slip out of Jacksonville? You know what I'm saying? Even if you get Baxter, I'm taking either Singleton out of Fleming Island or what is his name out of Trinity Christian, Traylon Webb. They need to get back into Jacksonville and get back into Trinity Christian Academy. So if they can get that done, that's something he needs to do. And I know that there's some offensive linemen scattered across the state in friendly areas, not only Jacksonville, but also down in Tampa. So they're going to have to make a huge push, like you said, this year, and they've got to make it happen. Do they make it into the top 3? We'll see.
Well, the other thing is, if you're competing with Georgia, again, I go to the same sort of analysis and say, look, they've only got 18 guys in the top 200 in the state of Georgia. So they're going to have to dip into South Carolina. They're going to have to dip into, into Florida, and they're going to have to dip into Alabama, where Alabama's got, again, though, 14 guys in the top 200. So there's a reason why those programs have been coming down to Florida and raiding the cupboard. The reason has been is that Florida and Texas are the 2 states with the most recruits. And so if Napier can just lock down the state, I know just, right? I mean, when Nick Saban walks in, people listen. In fact, one of those recruits on that list, my nephew's friends with, and, Alabama's his dream school. And so, look, that's a hard thing to overcome. There have been a lot of people who've been watching Alabama since they were born, basically at this point, dominate and win, right? Since they're old enough to remember football, at least. And, that's a hard thing to overcome, but that's what he's getting paid for, right? That's what they brought him in here to do. And I go back to, I think I didn't get a chance to get the whole thought out, but Napier asked for specific concessions from Florida before he came. That was what we heard, right? Is that the negotiations that were going on had to do with staff. It had to do with process. It had to setting up a machine that would allow him to compete with Georgia, with Alabama, with Clemson. and you look at what's going on at Auburn, this actually makes me feel happier about Napier as well, right? That he probably had an opportunity to jump to Auburn last year and said, no, that doesn't have everything I need in it. And now we're seeing what's going on with Brian Harsin there going, yeah, okay, I can understand why maybe he wanted to stay out of that particular situation. So just the evaluation of the jobs that are available, not jumping for it, those sorts of things, I think are promising. But again, I look at where the talent is. If he just draws a circle around the state of Florida, really around Gainesville, with let's say Cristobal can rake it in Miami. I still think if he draws a pretty decent circle down into that area that would traditionally be hurricane recruiting area, he's still going to come out with a class that's unbelievable just because of the level of talent that's there. So it really comes down to, the battles he didn't win against Brian Kelly the other day, the battles he didn't win against Jimbo Fisher. He's going to have to win those, and setting the apparatus in place to be able to win those this year is going to be indicative of what we're going to see from the program going forward, because you're not always going to have a state that's completely loaded the way this one is, particularly at positions of need. Billy, you mentioned running back, but they got cornerback, and there are a couple of really, really good offensive linemen. They're in the top sort of 50 or 55 overall nationally who are from the state of Florida. And so, to the point of what we were talking about in the last segment, if you get two top 50 guys, Bill, one of the things we glossed over, didn't get to from the article, is you looked at, top 10 at their position offensive linemen delivering versus below that. And at least at Florida, the delivery, it was like 70% or something of the guys who were top 10 offensive linemen wound up starting more than 20 games. And then if they were below that top 10, they might start, but the average was like 7 starts from those guys. And so if you want starts, if you want consistency, and if you want elite play, there's nowhere you can go better than getting some of those elite guys in there. And, that's not rocket science, but obviously having them in the state should make a difference.
And one other thought too, is that you don't have to lock down the whole state. You have to lock down the championship share of the state. And the great thing about Florida is that there's enough for Napier to get his, and for Cristobal to get his, and still for Alabama and Georgia to get some. He just has to take a little from here and a little from there and carve out a niche, because you're just not going to win if you don't recruit well in your home state.
And we've seen times in history, the mid 80s, where the Gators were putting some good teams on the field while Miami was producing national championship level teams. We saw when the Canes were last at their height in the early 2000s, Zook was recruiting fairly well. As we know, these two schools can recruit well at the same time, to Sykes' point there. Have y'all profiled what it takes, what a top 3 team looks like in terms of stars? Because I go through, it seems inconsistent year to year. The last 3 years, or from 2019 to 2021, it seems like a couple of the years, the top 2 teams have 7 5-star players. But then, like, you look at 2021, for example, Alabama was 7 5-star, 16 4-star. Ohio State, number 2, this is 24/7, by the way, 7 5-star, 14 4-star. And then the third place is LSU with 2 5-star, 16 4-star. So that's a pretty big drop from 7 to 2. Where should we be in that in terms of the 5-star equation? 3, 4 players at least, if we're talking having a shot at the top 3?
Well, I mean, go ahead, Will.
Well, I was just going to say, if you actually look at the numbers from 18 to 21, the average for the top 3 team is 298 points for the 24/7 ranking. And so, you can do that in 2 ways. The easiest way to do that is 5-star guys, because they're usually worth, 26, 27, 28 points, but you can also build that out on the back end. Now, I'm not a huge fan of recruiting guys in the 150 to 300 range just to build your points up. And I think for a couple of reasons, especially in the era of the transfer portal, a lot of those guys, if they get behind guys who are more talented, are just going to leave. And so you can really sort of strafe your depth. But the other part is that those guys don't deliver that much more than the guys who are ranked 300 to 500 overall. I think it's a lot harder to sort of gauge those guys. So, yeah, I mean, you're going to look at 4 or 5 stars, I would guess, is what you need to get to that place. But from a point total, that's where you end up at. The nice part is, because they only signed 17 this year, and because the transfers from a counter perspective, assuming they push out enough guys after the spring that they get to the 7 guys who transfer out and then go and play someplace else, the transfers shouldn't necessarily count against their initial counters that badly. And so they should be able to oversign next year in a way where, again, you could maybe goose your point total a little bit. But yeah, I mean, based on name, image, and likeness, that first tier, Jimbo sort of set the standard this year, and then you got Alabama and Georgia. So it's going to be over 300 points, I'm thinking, is where you're going to need to be.
Yeah, that's the numbers I was showing as well. The top three, it typically takes a little over 300, and right around 289 is what I show for the 5-year average for the number 5 class. To me, 2 5-stars this year is absolute bare minimum. And I'm going to be kind of meh about that. I really want to see 3. If they can do more than that, great. But can we not do one player better than Dan Mullen? You know what I mean? Like Dan Mullen got 1 in a couple of years, especially in your bump class. I really want to see 3+ 5 stars. And I'm not going to get too hung up on one spot versus another. If they were to get, I don't know. I don't even know if I'm ready to let them off the hook. I really want to see a top 5 class. I'm just kind of tired of hearing the excuses. We know now that they're well funded. We know now that they're well organized. We know now that they have every resource that was asked for. It should happen. This is the year it should happen.
I mean, well, you've done a really nice job of outlining. Like it's something like 2.7 5-stars is needed, I think, is the average that you came up with for SEC champions. This was back in like 2018, and the arms race hadn't quite gotten to the level it is right now. But basically, for all SEC champions since I think it was Phil Fulmer or something like that, you'd gone all the way back to and looked at the number of 5-stars, it was something like 2.6 or 2.7 5-stars, and like a class that was below that top 5, right? So I think it was like 4.6 or something like that for the overall class. That's like a minimum expectation for winning the SEC. And
by the way, Phil Fulmer landed 2 number 1 overall classes in the 5 years that preceded his national title. So apparently it was a thing back then too.
so even Elmer Fudd needed to be able to recruit.
It's the Jimmies and the Joes, my man.
Well, that's an episode of Stand Up and Holler. Another episode of Stand Up and Holler here, joined by Bill Sikes tonight. Be sure to check out his article on readandreaction.com called Blocking Progress: Why Billy Napier Faces a 12-Year Offensive Line Problem at UF. Bill, before we let you go, man, anything else you'd like to promote while you're here?
Not this time, guys, but I just really appreciate all the support and really appreciate the opportunity to come on. And I hope to do it again.
How about you, Will Miles? Any final words?
I just really appreciate you helping support the site, Bill. Whenever you call me and say, hey, I've got an idea, I'm like, oh, man, I'm not going to see anything for about 6 weeks. But when it comes out, it's going to be really cool and really well researched. And, I think it's funny. Some of the best stuff on the site, or at least the stuff that I always refer to, is I would like to say that it's stuff I've written, but most of the time it's stuff you've written and researched. And so, it's a privilege to have you on here, but also a privilege to have you on Read and Reaction. It'll always add something to the story. And our goal is to help people be smarter fans, and you certainly always help do that.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. I'm flattered, and I'm trying my best.
Well, thanks again, everybody, for joining us for another episode of Read and Reaction. Appreciate all the support on the YouTube channel. And be sure to check out our Patreon page, too, if you want to see this commercial free. We do a bonus episode there every week as well. Thanks again for the support. Have a great day. Go Gators. Thank you for watching this episode of Stand Up and Holler. Be sure to subscribe to the Read and Reaction YouTube channel. Join our Patreon community at Read and Reaction for bonus content each week, and check out our website at readandreaction.com. I'm Nick Knudsen, joined by Will Miles, and as always, go Gators.